All right, good morning, everyone. I'm sorry I lied to you that there were not going to be snacks and food and breakfast out there, and it turns out there are. So that's a bonus for all of us. Okay. I want to remind you about a couple things. If you'll be tweeting out whatever you want, just updates to what's going on in the conference or whatever, and use the hashtag, what is it again? Stand Firm Swibbits, SWBTS. So hashtag Stand Firm Swibbits, SWBTS. You will be entered into the drawing for one of Nancy's hard to find right now, unfortunately, books. I also want to remind you that if you do want to purchase the book, Lifeway Tables will get that ordered for you for free shipping. If you want it sent to you, you can also pick it up there at a pretty drastically reduced rate. So check that out there, but definitely do the tweets, and we will do a drawing at the last plenary for that. The other way to get a possible book is to fill out a contact card from the Swibbits table, and we'll do a drawing. Actually, we'll do two drawings from that. One will be at the next plenary, and then one will be at the last plenary. So that's definitely the better chances to win, is by filling out a card for Southwestern. But there you go. I guess you can't do that, though, if you're students. Sorry, already. Yeah, sorry. All right, well, I will give Tim a much bigger introduction at his plenary talk here in the next bit. Or no, I guess you're at the end of the day, sorry. So I'm just going to welcome him up now, and we're going to hear from Tim McGrew on how to think about miracles.
Thank you, Travis. I hear Keith Lofton promised I would perform a miracle this morning, and I told him that would be the miracle of the disappearing audience. So you can add that one to your canonical list now. Thank you so much for being here. I love Texas. It might have something to do with the fact that I'm coming down between November and March. I don't know, but you guys do an excellent impersonation of Michigan summer. We love it. So thank y'all. I'm thinking, I love Michigan. I'm a loyal citizen of Michigan. I am thinking of applying for dual citizenship, though.
It's only in the winter.
Yes, well, we'd like to throw our winters in at no extra charge. If you would like our winters, you may have them. Actually, we need to arrange something where y'all come up to Michigan in the summer and we come down here in the winter. That'll work really well. I'd like to talk to you about how to think about miracles. Not what to think about miracles. What to think about miracles would be a different talk. I have that talk. We can do that. But that would be to tell you about the evidence for specific claims. Here I want to move up a level, talk at a level of generality. I was at the Atheist Christian Book Club in Arlington last night, being grilled by a bunch of friendly atheists. They don't eat babies. We checked. It was okay. But they really wanted to know what I thought about this and that and the other thing, and one of the things that came up, sure enough, was, but miracles, look around you. You're not seeing them. Dead people stay dead. And that is a very old line of argument. Today, I would like to pursue that line of argument. Usually, I start out a talk like this with an epigraph drawn from Scripture. I have an epigraph, but in this case, I've chosen not to do it from Scripture, but something else. I'm going to quote from a French experimental scientist from the 19th century. Doubt, said François Arago, is a proof of modesty. It has seldom harmed the progress of the sciences. I could not say as much for incredulity. Apart from pure mathematics, whoever pronounces the word impossible is wanting in prudence. By the time we're done, I hope you see why I chose that as the epigraph for this talk. Let's dive right into the middle of it with the Prince of Skeptics. David Hume, born in 1711, died in the year of the American Revolution, 1776. Hume is the author of the most popular and undoubtedly the most influential argument against the credibility of reported miracles ever written. It's an essay. It's called Of Miracles. It was published in his Philosophical Essays in 1748. If you've read this in a philosophy class, you may know that work by the way it got retitled later as The Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. When I was a student studying philosophy as an undergraduate, I was very interested in the topic of miracles, And I asked my professors, well, what should I read on this? And their answer was, read Hume. And once I had read Hume, I said, okay, I read Hume. What should I do next? And the answer was, you should read Hume again. Hume cast a very long shadow across the 19th and 20th centuries. And at the time I was in school in the 1980s, his view was the dominant view, which is strange because there's been a sea change in the fortunes of Hume's argument over the last couple of decades. Here is a quotation from an agnostic philosopher of science at the University of Pittsburgh. It is almost universally assumed by Hume's admirers and critics alike that Of Miracles offers a powerful and original argument against miracles. On the contrary, I contend that Hume's argument is largely derivative, almost wholly without merit where it is original, and worst of all, reveals the impoverishment of his treatment of inductive reasoning. I repeat, John Earman is an agnostic. He is not saying this out of any apologetic bias. He is saying this because he's a specialist in non-deductive reasoning, and he realizes that the principle that Hume is trying to enunciate, if it were applied widely, would not just block out belief in miracles, it would block things that we need to be able to do in the sciences. And that's a problem. Ehrman gets pestered sometimes about this because of writing a book with such a brash title, right? You don't call an argument an abject failure unless you're going to be ready to take some flack from this guy's partisans. And he says, no doubt, Hume's admirers will foam at the mouth at this. Good. There's been too much genuflecting at the altar of David Hume. I'm going to try to be a little more ironic in tone, but I do want to, in substance, make 3 points, which I would like to convince you of. I think these 3 points are commonsensical, but every one of them puts me at odds with David Hume in his essay. Here are the 3 key points I would like to make. Number 1, the existence of a stable order of nature where dead people stay dead and virgins aren't having babies as virgins does not count as evidence against the existence of miracles. Number 2, it ought to be possible to change one's mind about miracles. Rationally change one's mind. And number 3, the proper way to arrive at a reasonable belief is to examine the evidence in detail. To me, those seem very sensible. To you, perhaps not. I don't know how many of you are members of the loyal opposition here, and that's fine if you are, but I want to persuade you of these 3 theses. For those of you who are taking notes, I'll make my PowerPoint slides available to everybody. So relax, let the cramp out of your hand. It will. This is going to be like drinking from a fire hose a little bit, but not only will I give you everything I have, but there are going to be some books I'm going to cite that are older books by Hume's contemporaries. I have PDFs of those. They're in the public domain. I'll give you those for free. So if you want them, just reach out to me afterward, and I will send you those or tell you where to get them. Point number 1, the existence of a stable order of nature does not count as evidence against the existence of miracles. Now that is directly opposed to what Hume says. Here's a quotation from Hume's essay Of Miracles, part 1, paragraph 12. A miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. And as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle from the very nature of the fact is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. Now, what do we have to oppose to a proof against miracle that is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined? Well, we've got testimony that the miracle happened. What do you think is going to happen in the arm wrestling contest between a proof that's unbeatable and something else? Not rocket science to figure this out. You don't even have to take a logic class, right? The one that can't be beaten isn't going to be beaten. And so no matter how much evidence you bring forward on behalf of a miracle, the fact that by definition it is already in the tank means you can't rationally be swayed over by evidence to belief in it. Even before we examine the question about what the uniformity of the course of nature would mean, I think that we should have a little warning light going off at this point. There's a very important question, fundamental question in the theory of knowledge that everyone needs to ask, and that is, when should I change my mind? We run around the world with various beliefs, and sometimes we change them. We'd like to be able to change them reasonably, rationally. To put it a different way, and to put it as a question one could put to Hume or one of Hume's followers, if you are wrong, how will you find out? Because once you wall yourself off from evidence and you say, I don't really care how much evidence there is, I have a get-out-of-jail-free card, then if you are wrong, you won't find out. Here's one of Hume's contemporaries, William Adams, on Hume. Adams was Samuel Johnson's Latin tutor, for those of you who like intellectual history. An experienced uniformity in the course of nature hath been always thought necessary to the belief and use of miracles. These are indeed relative ideas. There must be an ordinary, regular course of nature before there can be anything extraordinary. A river must flow before its stream can be interrupted. What Adams is pointing to here can be put as a more general principle in the case of evidence across all fields. This is the one point where those of you who are allergic to mathematics may want to just close your eyes, because there's a little math expression that's going to appear in the middle of the next slide. So it's either close your eyes or grit your teeth or pull out the little EpiPen and be ready, because here it comes, okay? So here's the principle. If, on the supposition that M, which I've chosen to stand for miracle, were true, it would be inevitable that O also be true, where O is there's a regular order of nature. Then O cannot be evidence against M. Here it comes. If the probability of O given M equals 1, then the probability of M given O has to be either greater than or equal to the probability of M. It can't be less. Open your eyes. Okay, so what does that mean in a more application-friendly kind of context? Well, in religious context, what are miracles supposed to be? They're signs. And Nicodemus knows this, right? We go to John 3. Nicodemus comes to Jesus by night, and what does he say? Rabbi, we know that you're a teacher sent from God because what? No one can do the works you do unless God is with him. Well, that chain of reasoning, which I think is completely sound, presupposes that there's a difference between the normal order of nature and something that's happening when God is with you. That's a distinction that he is making. In religious context, generally, miracles are supposed to function as signs, but miracles that function as signs would be impossible unless they took place against a backdrop of a stable natural order, since that's what enables them to function as signs. If your 8th grade teacher once, for the fun of it, turned water into wine right in front of you by putting his hands over the beaker of wine and saying a brief prayer, then you would look back at Jesus and you would say, well, I mean, I guess there are a few people who've got that ability. My 8th grade teacher was another one of them. It's rare, I don't have it, but that's kind of cool. But it wouldn't be a miracle then. It wouldn't be a sign. It would just be like, oh, I guess, some people can do this. Therefore, the existence of a stable natural order cannot be used as an argument against miracles in religious contexts. If you like that in pictures, here it is in pictures. I have a message that I'd like you to come away with today. If you walk out of this room with nothing else, I want you to believe it. Here it is. Please, I'm serious. I want you to take this away. But the trouble is you can't tell what I'm trying to say because I used a black background and a black font. So it's not standing out against the background. You can't tell it's any different from the background. From your perspective, it just looks like the background, and there's no message there that you can come away with. It would be more helpful if there were a background of one kind, and then my sign stood out against it, like this. Okay? You can see what I'm saying because you can see that it's different from the rest of the stuff around it. You can tell that a miracle is a miracle and not just a rare natural event because it's the kind of thing nature can't do on its own. That's the point that I'm trying to drive home. Point number 2, it ought to be possible to change one's mind rationally about miracles. We all know we can do irrational changes of mind, but I'm talking about reasoned responses to evidence. Here, I'll bring in some aid from another person who's certainly no friend of organized religion, the philosopher William James. In his book, The Will to Believe, he says, a rule of thinking which would absolutely prevent me from acknowledging certain kinds of truth, if those kinds of truth were really there, would be an irrational rule. Again, think of the fundamental question: how will you know if you are wrong? When should you change your mind? If you have a rule of thinking that says, if I'm wrong, I will never change my mind on it, you have a problem. This is not to say that you have to be completely credulous and just believe everything somebody tells you. Of course we don't want that. We're not talking here about being silly and easy to persuade. We're talking about having a principled objection to changing your mind ever. In empirical matters, that is a problem. Now you might say, all right, I'm down with that. We'll take William James's word for it, if not yours. But surely Hume didn't get in the way of that, did he? And I think he did. So I'd like to quote from his essay some passages that seem to do that. Hume on not changing one's mind. Here, talking of someone who rejected a miracle claim, he says, he therefore concluded, like a just reasoner, that such an evidence carried falsehood upon the very face of it, and that a miracle supported by any human testimony was more properly a subject of derision than of argument. Any human testimony. Any human testimony? How can you do that? How can you do that a priori? Yes, any human testimony. Okay, maybe we caught him at a bad moment rhetorically. Surely he doesn't say that elsewhere. Okay, let's go for another one. Paragraph 38. But should this miracle be ascribed to any new system of religion, men in all ages have been so much imposed on by ridiculous stories of that kind that this very circumstance, the fact that it's being ascribed to a new system of religion, would be a full proof of a cheat, and sufficient with all men of sense, not only to make them reject the fact, but even reject it without farther examination. If he is wrong, how will he find out? This is not just a fluke. He keeps on going. As the violations of truth are more common in the testimony concerning religious miracles than in that concerning any other matter of fact, this must diminish very much the authority of the former testimony and make us form a general resolution never to lend any attention to it, with whatever specious pretense it may be covered. Now, maybe you're sitting there and you're thinking, okay, Hume's overstating, you caught him, but he does have a point. And that point is, we're talking about religious contexts, and honestly, you know, Tim, you don't live down here in the South, but we do, and we've got con men down here who are preying upon people, and religious contexts are exactly what they go for. And you're right. That is where they go. So if there's a place where you would expect a false pretense of a miracle, it would be a religious context. Where would you expect a real miracle, if there were any? Almighty God having nothing better to do, making some grain of sand in the Sahara Desert where nobody's watching shift and tumble in a non-Newtonian way? Is that really, honestly, what we're thinking about here? No. If there were real miracles, they would be for a reason. They would authenticate some teaching we very much need to hear. So the sad fact of the matter is, both fake miracles and real miracles are more likely to occur in a religious context than anywhere else. Therefore, the fact that it's a religious context isn't going to discriminate true from false. That has to be done on the basis of evidence, not simply by saying, oh, religion, and waving one's hand. That won't do. But maybe you're wondering, okay, yeah, that sounds good. That goes over at an apologetics conference, but maybe you're sort of gerrymandering the rules here somehow because it's religion. So let's do a test case outside of religion. Let's go to science. Let's talk about meteorites. Do meteorites really fall from the sky? Well, ancient peoples did report stories about stones that fall from heaven, and sometimes they would even build religious shrines around them. But at the height of the age of reason, late 18th, early 19th centuries, most scientists were incredulous of such reports because, really, now, stones falling from the sky, rocks from the sky. We know better than that. Besides, most of the people who are reporting these things are peasants. And what do peasants know? Easy to fool. Some very great names and people who did remarkable and important and fundamental work in the history of science fell in with this kind of snobbery. Lavoisier, father of modern chemistry, not only dismissed written affidavits that the stones were still warm when they were discovered, he actually changed a peasant's affidavit, went in there with his pen and crossed out what the guy said and wrote something else and said, pro tip, do not do this. When somebody gives you an affidavit and you don't believe what he said, don't change what he said. Say that he's a peasant and peasants are ignorant. Say whatever you like, but do not change his deposition. That's a mistake. If you are wrong, that is not the way to find out. Laplace, a very great astronomer and mathematician, interrupted a presentation on a fall of meteorites being given at the French Academy of Sciences, shouting, "We already know enough such fables." Well, I guess that's the end of that one. In fact, Ernst Cladini, who wrote the most important work on meteorites in 1819, tells us that a disbelief and scorn regarding this was so widespread that many museums had discarded their collections of meteorites for fear of being ridiculed. It ain't the things you don't know that'll get you, it's the things you know that ain't so. My third proposition. The proper way to arrive at a reasonable belief is to examine the evidence in detail. And here, for a little while, it seems that Hume and I are actually on the same page. He makes a promising start. Here's the maxim that he gives at the end of part 1 of his essay, paragraph 13. When anyone tells me that he saw a dead man restored to life, I immediately consider with myself whether it be more probable that this person giving me this testimony should either deceive or be deceived, or that the fact which he relates should really have happened. I weigh the one miracle against the other. And according to the superiority which I discover, I pronounce my decision and always reject the greater miracle, by which he means the more improbable thing. If the falsehood of his testimony would be more miraculous than the event which he relates, then, and not till then, can he pretend to command my belief or opinion. In philosophical circles, this passage is much praised because it seems to offer just an overwhelmingly rational sounding approach. Oh, you're going to have to give me your evidence, but it's going to have to be evidence that can overcome this antecedent improbability. The trouble is, Hume's already rigged the game by saying that nothing can overcome that antecedent improbability. What do you think in the generations following the publication of Hume's critique? What do you think the Christians said in response? What do you think their response to that was? What would your minister's response to that be? To make an exception? To say, well, that's all very well in the sciences, but in matters of faith, we do it differently? That was not the response of Hume's contemporaries. Here's the kind of response he got from Peter Bain. Exactly! No statement could be more reasonable. Let us proceed then to the comparison. The Christian has to produce testimony to miracle, whose falsehood would be a mightier wonder than the miracle attested. And Hume has to weigh miracle against miracle. Game on. Bring it. Let's do that. What was the next step to be taken in Hume's argument? What did his own statement require him to do? Clearly, to take up the miracles which Christians allege to be true, to set their evidence fully and distinctly forth, and to point out that, however plausible that evidence might be, its fallaciousness would be no miracle compared to the miracle affirmed. Let's do this. How many of you have read Hume's essay of miracles? But every reader of Hume's essay knows that he has done nothing of the sort. The nature of the evidence required for the Christian miracles, once fairly stated, those miracles are quietly put by him out of court. The trial proceeds by proxy. Hume does not ask what proof is offered that the Christian miracles took place. He calls to the bar certain miracles with which Christianity has nothing to do, enters upon their evidence, condemns them as falsities, and then calmly informs the court that the Christian miracles have been disproven. Would we do this in a court of law to someone who is accused of a crime? Here, we'll pull you in, and we're going to accuse you of some horrible crime, and then I'm going to pull in some scruffy-looking figure, set him up there, and demonstrate that he has committed crimes, and when I'm done, we'll condemn you. No, this is not justice, but this is Hume's procedure. The healings said to have been done by the touch of the Emperor Vespasian in honor of the god Serapis at Alexandria in Egypt. Some healings alleged to have taken place around the tomb of the recently deceased Jansenist, the Abbé Paris. What? Not going to engage with the Christian claims? No, not at all. Now, maybe you're sitting there thinking, okay, but aren't you leaving something out here? Let's try to restate this a little more plausibly. It requires more evidence to establish a miraculous claim than it does to establish an ordinary one. If you tell me, hey, you know what? I was up early this morning and the sun rose in the east. Yeah, I believe it. If I tell you I was up really early this morning and the sun rose in the north, you're going to need more than just my say-so for that. Fair tag. Absolutely. And this is what Hume's own contemporaries were actually willing to grant. But there's also a not so plausible form of this that is tagged to a popular slogan. Tell me, raise your hand if you've seen this one. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Ever hear that one? If you haven't heard this one, you are not paying attention and you need to live a little bit more online, which is a line I never thought I would say. But there's a really serious question here. What exactly does that slogan mean? It was made popular by Carl Sagan, who was the first presenter for Cosmos, if you've ever seen any episodes of the old show Cosmos. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And so in his honor, I have reconstructed the argument and I have christened it the Argumentum Sagani. And here, as best I am able to tell, is how it goes. Premise 1, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Premise 2, the claim that a miracle has occurred is extraordinary. Therefore, any evidence supporting it ought to be extraordinary as well. Premise 4, I'm not sure what I mean by extraordinary. Premise 5, but whatever you come up with, it's not going to work. Therefore, no one is justified in believing a miracle claim. I swear I've seen this argument done many times online, and that's what it comes to. Let's do a scientific test case on this kind of incredulity. There's a physical theory proposed in nuclear physics according to which spontaneous proton decay happens, but it happens really rarely, so rarely that so far we have never observed an instance of it. So there's a 100% track record against our seeing protons spontaneously decay. We can smash them up in particle colliders, but just the idea that they would pop apart by themselves, never been seen. But scientists are undeterred. They have set up sensitive detectors in underground water tanks in geographically separated locations in an attempt to see whether this actually takes place. Now, if they were reasoning in a Humean way, they would reason like this. The proof against spontaneous proton decay is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined, because we have a 100% no rate on it so far. Therefore, if your detectors did go off signaling a spontaneous proton decay, it would be more rational to believe your detectors were malfunctioning than to believe that a proton had actually decayed. But in that case, why are we spending money setting up these observation tanks if we're going to discard the observations anyway? This is the kind of thing that makes an agnostic philosopher of science read Hume on miracles and say, wait a minute, the principle you're trying to apply here would block out actual science. And so, paradoxically, so far from belief that miracles are possible being a science stopper, it turns out that an absolute principled refusal ever to believe any evidence for an unprecedented event is the real science stopper. So the fact that 100% of these protons so far observed have not decayed doesn't mean it's impossible for us to accept evidence of such decay. Okay, all right, but still, what about that sun rising in the north example? Well, let me quote Bishop Thomas Sherlock from his Trial of the Witnesses of the Resurrection, published in 1729. His protagonist says, "I do allow that this case and others of like nature require more evidence to give them credit than ordinary cases do. You may therefore require more evidence in these than in other cases. But it is absurd to say that such things admit no evidence when the things in question are quite manifestly objects of sense." Really, what are we talking about with the resurrection of Jesus? We're talking about being able to tell whether someone is dead or alive and being able to identify them. How many of you had a close friend, maybe in high school, somebody you hung out with a lot? Yeah? The rest of you need to get out more because you need friends, people, seriously. Can you remember a day when you spent most of the day with this person? Could be a member of your family. Those of you who aren't raising your hand, I'm thinking, wow, so you were orphans raised in the desert or something? Okay. Think about that day. Can you honestly swear to two propositions? Number one, it really was your friend and not somebody cleverly impersonating that friend. You think you can be sure of that? Because people people misidentify people sometimes. Are you sure? Number two, if I put you in a court and I put your hand on a Bible and I said, swear to this, are you really sure that during that day this person was alive and not dead? Think you could pull it off? Because that's all the expertise it requires. You don't have to have, a medical license in order to determine, yeah, my friend was alive. And it was really my friend. This isn't so specialized as all that. It's really pretty straightforward stuff. I do want to note that Sherlock's book was published in the year that Hume turned 18. This was well before the publication of Hume's essay. So his objection had been anticipated and addressed very moderately and reasonably before he ever wrote it. Now, maybe you're thinking, all right, but there's still a problem. There's tons of miracle claims. There are many religions, thousands upon thousands of miracle claims. You're right. But how could anyone hope to use miracles as evidence for religion when there are so many claims? I suppose you want me to start by looking at yours, don't you? Well, why should I start looking at your miracle claims rather than those of Baha'i or of Islam or any other religion? I think that's a fair objection, and I think it deserves to be met in a straightforward way. There are neutral criteria that make no reference to any particular religious creed, and can be seen to be reasonable without appeal to one religion or another, that can help to filter out unpromising candidates for a religious miracle. And this set of criteria that I'm going to be talking about was articulated by John Douglas in a book published in 1757, one of the early responses to Hume. He says a miracle claim may reasonably be doubted. Doesn't mean that we've proved it's false, but it may reasonably be doubted when, number one, it is reported only long after the miracle is supposed to have happened, or, number two, it is reported only a great distance away from the scene, or third, when it would have been allowed when first made to pass without examination. If any of those criteria are met, we have a reason to doubt. It could still really have happened, but this is a reason to doubt. So what we can do is we can take these thousands and thousands of claims and filter them to get the most promising places to start first. In a debate that I did down here a couple of years ago with Zachary Moore, who is a big name in the Texas atheist circles, I made this case in my opening statement. I said, look, when should you doubt a miracle? And I gave reasonable grounds for doubting miracle claims. And I said, so the fact that there are many miracle claims doesn't mean that we should be paralyzed in evaluation. The first thing we should do is to say, well, let's see what the most promising ones are, and we can start there if any of them pass through this filter. When I was done with my opening statement, I went to sit down. I realized that Zach looked a little bit green. He got up and he gave his prepared talk, which was a long list of miracle claims in other religions, none of which passed through the filter unscathed. So, inoculation, it's a good debate strategy. Get out there in front of them. I am not so poor a chess player as not to anticipate my opponent's moves. So let's look at some claims that fail on the first criterion. The criterion is when the first report comes long after the event. So there's a parallel that some atheists, Bart Ehrman among them, like to bring up to the gospel accounts of Jesus, and this is Philostratus' Life of Apollonius of Tyana. This was written over a century after the death of Apollonius, but because Apollonius was a first century sage, he's a nice parallel for Jesus, so they think. But the claims Philostratus is making, he's making in the early 3rd century, and that's the first time we hear of them. He claims to be taking them from a document, but not only don't we have the document, we don't have any other indication that the person who supposedly wrote this document ever existed. There's only Philostratus' word, oh, I have a source, and that's it. That's a reason to doubt. Does it mean Apollonius never worked any miracles? No, it doesn't guarantee that, but that is a reason for doubt. The Lives of Pythagoras attribute some miracles to him, but they were written 8 centuries after his time, not promising candidates. Many of the miracle claims in the Middle Ages come up only much later, not during this person's lifetime, not in the writings of people who were contemporaries, but only in biographies written 40, 50, 80, 100 years later. That's reason to worry about it. Second criterion, when the first report of the miracle is made only at a great distance from the alleged event. Again, almost all the miracles attributed to Apollonius fail on that. If I tell you somewhere in the Himalayas there is a Sherpa who can turn water into wine, you're probably not going to make the trip. It's so far away, it's pretty safe from investigation. Third criterion, when the miracle claim would be allowed to pass without critical examination, perhaps because it supports or affirms established opinions and prejudices. Again, virtually all of the miracle claims of the Middle Ages fall into this. Saint Genevieve, so saintly that as she walks, flowers spring up in her footsteps. Well, you know, if you're already committed to that particular form of Christianity and you think Saint Genevieve was a wonderful person, you may not have much motivation to go digging critically into the question of whether these miracles took place. The healings attributed to Vespasian in Alexandria were done at a time when Vespasian needed cred because he wasn't nobly born, but he was announcing his aspirations to become the emperor. He wasn't the emperor yet, he was a general at that time. And they worked in favor of the local religion because the worship of Serapis was experiencing a lot of challenges right around that time from these Christians. So they kind of needed a boost as well. So everything worked together. There wasn't a lot of motivation on anyone's part to dig into that one. The alleged restoration of a man's leg in Saragossa. Well, that was supposed to have occurred because they rubbed the stump of his leg with holy oil, and then there was the leg whole again. Might have been allowed to pass without too much examination because it fell in with the existing religious prejudices. Again, William Adams, Hume's contemporary, puts this in a nice way. There's a wide difference betwixt establishing false miracles by the help of a false religion and establishing a false religion by the help of false miracles. Nothing is more easy than the former of these. Nobody's motivated to check into it. Nothing's more difficult than the latter. To drive this home, let me just give you a thought experiment. Suppose that you have nothing better to do and you're somewhat unscrupulous and you decide, I would like to found a new religion. It's been tried, right? We got L. Ron Hubbard doing this in our time. You want to do this somewhere where it's likely that the miracles won't be opposed vigorously. So I'll tell you what, if I'm equally unscrupulous and I decide that for a cut of your profits, I'll bankroll your operation, I'll give you a ticket. And you can try to start your new religion. You got a choice. I'll get you a one-way ticket to Milwaukee or a one-way ticket to Mecca. Where would you rather try to start a new religion? Milwaukee, which might have something to do with the fact that if you choose Mecca, you will be dead before you hit baggage claim. All right. Yes, doing this in the face of the opposition, not a promising way, because the opposition is going to be highly motivated to critique you. Where was the resurrection proclaimed? Jerusalem. When was it proclaimed? 50 days after Jesus' crucifixion. Who was in charge there? Still the same people who had procured Jesus' crucifixion, the same Jewish authorities, the same Roman authorities. This was proclaimed at the time, in the place, in the teeth of opposition, who, if it were false, had means, overwhelming motive, and opportunity to disprove it. Now, there's an interesting place to begin our investigation of the question, have any miracles ever really occurred? I'll close with words from one of the great theologians of all time. It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. Thank you. We have some microphones up here if you got any questions. So I think that the drill is, since they're trying to record these sessions, if you have a question, do they come up or do you go to them? Oh, the microphone comes to you. The mountain comes to Muhammad. So if you got any questions, stick a hand in the air. Don't be shy.
So I'm trying to think of this from like the other side, and I'm thinking, is from a naturalistic framework, is the origin of life not in itself a miracle that they're willing to accept?
So first of all, Kristen?
Yes.
Yay, hi, good to see you in person.
Yes.
Second, yes. So that's a sticky one for them. The origin of life is a place where so many things have to happen just right for us to get even the very simplest, most stripped down bacterium off the ground, that it's very hard to see how that could happen given the resources that we know to be available in our universe. A non-religious bioinformatics specialist, Eugene Koonin, has actually written a book fairly recently called The Logic of Chance, in which he argues that the mathematical problems are so bad, the barrier so high for the spontaneous origin of life in our universe, that the multiverse theory must be true and there must be quadrillions of other universes out there where this is being tried, and somewhere among them somehow one of them got lucky. And they say Christians have too much faith. I mean, that's really asking for quite a leap. But he, from a biological perspective, says, well, It's a good thing we've got some physicists who are telling us that there's a multiverse, because that's what we need. So yeah, it's a big problem, but they'll try to get around it by expedients that look more than a little bit odd to those of us looking on, saying, but if I don't come to this with an a priori commitment to naturalism, why, again, would I buy into that? Doesn't that at least suggest that if there's a different explanation that makes the phenomenon much more likely, I should look into that? Great question. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. My name's Neil. I have a question about your second criteria of doubt for miracles, about the distance.
Yes.
Would you say that's maybe the weakest of the three? Just because, if I was overseas on a trip and my wife called me and said someone broke into our house, and I wouldn't be saying, no, you're probably wrong about that.
But then the first report is being made from your house.
What?
Then the first report is being made from your house. It's not just the distance from you, but the distance from the event where the first report is made.
Okay. So
here's Philostratus. He's over here sitting in Italy telling you about miracles that took place in India, and it's the first that anyone hears about them. You're not hearing the reports coming from India, you're hearing the reports coming from him.
Okay, that makes
so
more
that,
sense.
Does that help to clarify?
It does. It's just when you gave the example, you had mentioned a report of a miracle in the Himalayas, and they were telling, and that was
right.
Kind of,
if
so
your friend was actually in the Himalayas and telling you that, then the report's coming from him at ground zero.
Okay,
but if I, standing here, tell you here that that's happening over there, that's a different matter.
Perfect. Thank you.
Don't you all be shy now. There we go.
So given Hume's definition of miracles, how would you propose we define miracles instead?
Great question. I would describe a miracle as an event that exceeds the productive power of nature. An event that nature alone, including beings much like ourselves, cannot produce. So if it's an event that exceeds the productive power of nature, then something other than nature must be at work there. I would also say I think Hume's definition of laws of nature is prejudicial. Hume wants to define them as unexceptioned regularities. Laws of nature tell us how nature always behaves. I think that's not quite right. When we're looking for the laws of nature, we are trying to figure out how nature behaves when it is left alone, when it's left to itself. And even on a very rich theological interpretation, there's a sense in which God has given the universe certain properties, certain characteristics, and things happen in that in a regular order of nature. Necessary background. You can have ever so much evidence for the laws of nature, and that evidence will not tell you whether the universe is left to itself. That is a separate question that needs to be decided on its own evidence. And that, I think, is the point that Hume is missing. And so that's why it's not enough to say, well, miracles, you Christians, you believe in virgins who are having babies. Why, yes, thank you. We've been shouting from the housetops that this is a miracle, and you're going to flummox us by pointing out there's something a little bit odd about it? Really? So, yeah, right, we know this doesn't happen when nature is left to itself. Guess what that means? Nature's not being left to itself. And then the whole question becomes, did the event really happen? In a book called The Christian Virtuoso, Robert Boyle, the eminent scientist, friend of Isaac Newton, says, the person who is in the best position to judge the truth of Christianity is the virtuoso, the man who has studied nature and understands science so that he knows what nature can do and what it cannot. Without that knowledge, we're not in as strong a position as we could be to tell what might be a miracle. And that's a motivation to study nature, to know what it can do when it is not being interrupted by a divine hand who can, though he rarely does, intervene into affairs and make things happen that would not otherwise have happened. Now the hands are going up.
So with your second point, just kind of asking when ought someone be able to change their mind rationally,
Yes.
how might you apply that like to the story of Abraham coming from like a Kierkegaard perspective? A lot of people might say, in Kierkegaard would say,
Well, I
Abraham-
need you to speak a little more into the mic because I'm dropping some of your words.
sorry, like Kierkegaard said Abraham kind of had to surpass human understanding when God said, sacrifice your son. So could you say, technically that might have been a time for Abraham to say, well, maybe I should change my mind because
Because
is a
now the
reasonable-"
voices in my head are telling me to kill my son,
Right.
right? I really like Paul's take on this. What does he say Abraham believed? Since God had promised that his seed would come through Isaac, he will raise the boy from the dead if that's what it takes. I already know with whom I'm dealing. This is not some unknown, sudden thought flickering through his head. But also, since you brought that up, can I just make the point that the overall moral of the story is that right there, God ended any pretensions that human sacrifice was ever going to be done. The big moral of the story is, never mind, I see what you're willing to do, but that's not really the way it's going to happen. Here, I've provided a ram.
So there are so many events claimed as a miracle, and some of them are like a single eyewitness.
Yeah.
So how do we decide which one is a miracle, which one is not a miracle?
So this is the reason that I think we should apply the filter and say, find, if there are any, promising places to begin. When we do that, then we investigate them on their own evidence. Look, even within the Bible, there are some miracle claims that are not as well attested as others. That floating axe head, not a lot of evidence for it. The resurrection of Jesus, an abundance of evidence. So what we do is we start with the things that we know first. Then they shed light on other things. If Jesus rose from the dead, something very big was going on. And it should not be surprising if there were other miracles in the vicinity. If he didn't, then the ones that we don't have a whole lot of direct evidence for, they got to stand or fall on their own. And I'm willing to put the whole case there. Did Jesus rise from the dead? Because if he didn't, Christianity is false no matter what else is true. And if he did, Christianity is true, and we can talk about the other details. So that's the hinge of it all, and it's not just me talking, that's the Apostle Paul who puts it all on the line right there in 1 Corinthians 15. The resurrection is the make or break event for Christianity. If it happened, then Christianity is true. However much we may disagree about the other details, and they may even be important, that's the heart, that's the bullseye, that's the center of the mark for Christianity.
This is kind of in the same vein, and I think you touched on it a little bit in your answer. But if an event is only recorded in the New Testament, does it fail to meet criterion 3? Because it's only Christians attesting to it.
If it were only recorded in the New Testament and Christianity were well entrenched in that area at that time, and there were no fervent opposition to it, then that would fail by the third criterion, not meaning it was false, but meaning now there's a reason to doubt. But it was something new. It came and stuck a finger in the eye of Judaism and said, your whole sacrificial system is now rendered obsolete by the one sacrifice once for all. Your nationalist pretensions are gone. Your hope of a military Messiah is misguided. You missed the point and you crucified your own Messiah. This is not how to win friends and influence people. And it was being promulgated where those were the people in power. Christianity was not an established religion. It was a religion trying to establish itself. Muhammad, when he was trying to start his religion, tried to ingratiate himself both to the Christians and to the Jews, the people of the book. And he tried by these mild means for 10 years to make converts. He made about 1 convert a month, mostly from his own family. And then he decided to try something different. He decided to raise an army. This has always been the best way to start a new religion. Take a double dose of testosterone, shake hard. That's how you do it. It's Joseph Smith's try. When Joseph Smith died, he was on the ballot for President of the United States as General Joseph Smith. The Nauvoo Legions were the largest standing army outside of Washington, D.C. in the United States. This is not somebody who was trying to do a miracle to persuade skeptical people. And Muhammad himself was asked over and over again, read the Quran, over and over again, work a miracle, show us a sign. And he said, you've already had miracles and signs, I'm not going to do that. Why not? Because they weren't going to buy it. He knew better than to try.
Hume seems to presuppose that the laws of nature exist. So assuming that Hume and many who agree with them are atheists, do they consider, or have you brought to them, that the very laws of nature is evidence of intelligent design? Or
So Hume would not consider that, but again, you have to remember Hume's own view of the laws of nature is an incredibly thin one. The laws of nature are simply pairs of properties found together. A followed by B, A followed by B again, A followed by B again. He doesn't even have any thick connections between them. And so he kind of reduces laws of nature to what happens in nature, exceptionlessly. So for him, any way that nature is, if you could find any regularity in it at all, then that's a law of nature. So he doesn't even have a rich conception of laws of nature of the kind that I think many people today would rather have, and many people tend to presuppose, even people who quote Hume without really realizing the full implications of his own reductive position on the nature of laws.
I would wonder where he'd get regularity from. But.
Where does he get regularity? Well, for him, it's just, hey, you know, I saw a raven and it was black. I saw another raven and it was black. Resemblance, contiguity, and cause and effect, which is just reduced in the end to these pairings. That's it. That's all he's got. Go.
So when communicating with someone who doesn't come out of a Christian background, who
Yeah.
may not accept the Bible, obviously is authoritative, would you recommend, when dealing with the issue of miracles, taking them to the resurrection first, and then talking about if the resurrection is real, then we can kind of see the thread, especially when dealing with things like Old Testament miracles? Or
Yeah, if they're ready for an example, that's the right place to go for many reasons. But, they're not always ready for an example. Story from the last time I was down here. I like to tell this as a joke. A Christian and 2 Buddhists walk into a bar. True story. I was speaking for the Bible and Beer Consortium at a bar here in Fort Worth, and I was talking about the evidential value of Acts, but afterwards, there had been a couple of Buddhists who were in there, and they wanted to talk, so I went back and sat at their table and talked with them, guy and a girl. The girl was a Buddhist because she had had a very charismatic comparative religion professor. The guy was a Buddhist because the girl was a Buddhist. And I said to them, after we chatted a little bit, I said, can I just ask you a question? If you were persuaded, whatever that would take, fully persuaded that Jesus of Nazareth died by crucifixion, was buried, and rose bodily again to life, and was seen by his disciples, unquestionably, really did, whatever it would take to persuade you, what would you do? I looked at the guy, he looked at the girl, and she said, well, that would be interesting, but, I don't really think it would change anything. I'm comfortable with my values. And at that point, I just said, thank you for your candid answer. But there's no point in bringing evidence to bear on the question of whether Jesus rose from the dead if they're not ready to say that would matter. That would change things. There's a prior conversation that you have to have in cases like that.